Hello, today I'm going to have a close look at the Capriccio for Violin and Orchestra by Krzysztof Penderecki. Penderecki was a Polish composer born in 1933 who unfortunately passed away only a few days ago on March 29th, 2020. And I was moved by his recent passing to go back and re-listen to some of his scores again, including this very piece, the Capriccio for Violin and Orchestra. I was struck upon re-listening to it by the piece's immediate power of expression. It's a sort of musical language that, regardless of whether or not you're familiar with post-war music or avant-garde music or sort of contemporary or modern composition, this is a piece that requires no real difficulty in terms of just getting into it and appreciating it. It's immediate. The power of expression in this piece is just right there on the surface. There's a kind of exaggerated, cartoonish, almost grotesque aspect to it. It's sarcastic, but there's also just something incredibly moving also about it. There's an intense expressive power in everything Penderecki wrote. So this piece belongs to his earlier period in which he was known internationally for creating these very vivid texture-based compositions in which traditional elements such as melody and rhythm are not particularly in evidence. In fact, in many cases, they're almost completely absent, except for in sort of parodistic quotation form. What you do have in this piece are these massive slabs of sound, of just sheer orchestral texture, along with an incredible sense of orchestration and a very innovative exploratory approach to writing for orchestra. In this sense, Penderecki was close to György Ligeti, who was also involved in leading these sorts of very interesting orchestral sonority sorts of explorations in the 1960s. There is, however, one major difference with Ligeti, which is that the Ligeti pieces of this period, so things like Atmosphère for orchestra, for example, these are pieces that are always highly directional in nature. In other words, they're always sort of starting from point A and then sliding inexorably towards point B in a sort of continuous process of morphing. In other words, the sound is always constantly moving, almost like a liquid, from one state into another. Penderecki's music doesn't really function that way. There's a major difference in terms of how his language operates. And his music is actually a lot closer, in many respects, to composers like Varèse or Stravinsky, in the sense that he uses these little blocks of material that are usually completely static. In other words, they have almost no directional tendency or evolutive trajectory within them. He'll take these little slabs of sound and sort of cut them up and have a little bit of this, and then he'll have a little bit of that, and sometimes they're superimposed and sometimes they're juxtaposed. But basically, it's an anti-organic approach to form most of the time. However, despite that, there is a kind of incredible dramatic sense that you get in Penderecki. He knows exactly how to time his materials. He knows exactly the point at which you have to stop something and start something else. And despite the fact that the material is sort of articulated in these little static blocks, there is nevertheless a sense of forward momentum in the pieces that really keeps you listening and keeps you engaged all the way through. So I'll just start by giving a few indications as to what this piece is trying to do. The first indication, perhaps the most obvious one, is the title, Capriccio for Violin and Orchestra. So a capriccio is basically a rather informal, semi-improvisatory sort of piece, very rapid and somewhat light in character. That's sort of what you get here, but it's also sort of not what you get here, because an entire third of the piece is actually completely the opposite of that. In other words, the piece is actually written in three large sections of approximately equal duration, 4 minutes each. And the central section is actually a very slow sort of lament. It's the opposite of a capriccio in many respects. And then the outer sections are indeed very fast. But the title does give you some idea of what to expect. So the music is very skittish. It's sort of constantly moving from one thing to the other very quickly. It has a lot of extremely rapid movement, and it's got a kind of lightness to it, a kind of humor about it. So in many respects, this piece is actually quite curious, because on the surface, it's made up of these really unusual sound qualities, clusters, really unusual percussion instruments, these strange sound effects and unusual instrumental playing techniques and so on. But at the same time, the actual formal layout of the piece is almost as conventional as you could possibly make it. So in other words, it is basically a three-movement violin concerto with the three movements collapsed into one single movement. You have two cadenzas for the soloist, one in the first section and one in the final section. And you have a fairly conventional rapport between the soloist and the orchestra. And so in many of these sort of external formal attributes, the piece is actually quite classical. But I think that at heart, Penderecki was always a kind of neo-romantic or neoclassical composer, in the sense that despite his fascination with sound materials in this piece, you can see very clearly that he's still trying to make a satisfying piece of music that functions in a coherent and cohesive way according to the logic of development and of our perception and the way we listen to music. So there's no real attempt in this piece, or indeed in many of the early Penderecki pieces, to sort of fundamentally experiment with the nature of composition itself in terms of the types of discourse that you have, the way that you can structure a piece. Instead, what he's doing is he's working with very, very exploratory sound materials, but within a framework that is entirely derived, in almost every respect, I would say, from the sort of most classical principles of composition. So let's have a look at the orchestration of this piece. The first thing you can observe is that it's written for a gigantic orchestra of 94 players. So there are some really unusual instruments in this orchestra, in addition to the sort of standard large orchestral setup. You have things like a harmonium. In the percussion section, you have a musical saw, which is really rare. You don't really see that very often in orchestral scores. There's one of the percussionists has to play on approximately 30 metal tubes of varying length and diameter. There's a very funny note in the score, I don't know if it's intentionally funny, where the composer states that some of these metal tubes could be made out of gold. It's like, I don't know how seriously this is taken by performers when they actually do the piece. But so you have these sort of untempered metal tubes that go together with other metallic sounds in the percussion, such as vibraphone and tubular bells. There's also a contrabass clarinet that often plays together in a kind of unit with the contrabassoon. There's a quartet of saxophones, and there's also an electric bass guitar. So clearly, Penderecki is setting up his orchestra in such a manner as to have a maximum of possible sound resources and different combinations of instruments. So analyzing a piece like this can represent a challenge, because as I stated at the outset, many of the conventional elements of a musical language are basically absent here. So in other words, pitch is present, but it's present in a kind of an unusual way, in the sense that most of the time we do not really apprehend the musical gestures in this piece in terms of pitch. We apprehend them statistically in terms of groups of sounds or aggregates of sounds or aggregates of frequencies, but you don't really think harmonically when you're listening to this piece. So in other words, even though there might be a cluster made up of 24 individual tones, you don't really hear those individual tones in a harmonic sense. It's something that contributes to an overall statistical mass of sound. So that's the first thing. And the other thing is that although there are also linear, sort of quasi-melodic passages in the piece, you don't really apprehend those melodically either, simply because they're played so incredibly quickly, first of all. And secondly, because the notes are essentially just points on a curve. In other words, they allow you to perceive a particular shape that might be rising, it might be descending, but the individual pitches of that line are not so important. What really is ultimately important is the gesture and the shape and the place that that line eventually takes you to. As far as rhythm is concerned, there are actually almost no conventionally notated rhythms in this piece. There's a couple at the very end, and we'll talk about that later. But most of the time, the piece is written in a kind of graphic rhythmic proportional notation, in which the different events are placed approximately here or there within the bar, but they don't necessarily line up with a pulse, right? So there's no possible perception of pulse most of the time when you're listening to this piece. What you do have are sounds that arrive more or less quickly, more or less slowly, and you have very rapid, repeated groups of notes. Most of the time those are written as a sort of continuum of 16th notes, and that's the closest you really get to a sense of pulse in this piece. But again, most of the time what you do have is a pulseless form of notation, which is essentially graphic and proportional in nature. So we need to talk about what the actual elements are in this composition. So if they're not rhythm and if they're not pitch, what exactly are they, and how can you analyze a piece like this? Well, I think probably the best approach to take in terms of just figuring out how this piece is put together is understanding that basically almost all the materials in the entire piece can be reduced down to a few small categories of sounds. So I'm going to present those categories, and then what we're going to do is look at the first few pages of the score and just look at how those manifest and how the composer works with these different raw materials in the piece. So the first sort of basic sound typology that I would describe in this composition is clusters. So that's a pretty straightforward concept. Clusters are basically groups of adjacent semitones, or sometimes quarter tones. So in other words, you can have semitonal chromatic clusters, or you can have infrachromatic clusters in which the intervals between pitches are smaller than a semitone. But basically what these are frequency bands. So in other words, the composer will take a certain range of sound, and then all of the tones within that space will be present in this one sound object. Now the clusters are sometimes presented in a completely static fashion. In other words, you have sort of a block of X number of pitches within a certain frequency range, and they just sort of sit there. It's as though you were to take a piece of fabric and just cut it off, and then you've just got this length of fabric, and then it stops. That's how a lot of these sound materials work. So there's no real inner directionality to some of these blocks. However, there are also other types of clusters in this piece in which there is some kind of an sort of inner articulation to the sound object. So in other words, there might be a variation in terms of the rhythm, or in terms of the articulation, or the color, or something like that. He does something to animate the cluster from within. Next, you have what I would call these sort of chattering repeated note figures. So in other words, you'll take a pitch, or sometimes a group of pitches, and have it be repeated in a sort of staccato, irregular rhythm by an instrument or by a group of instruments. Thirdly, we have these very rapidly moving lines. Now, this is one area of the composition where you can speak of directionality, because generally the lines, the sort of linear movement of pitches in this composition, are employed in such a manner as to lead you somewhere. And most of the time, this is a very, very clear and straightforward form of directionality. In other words, the line will move upwards, or it'll move downwards, or it'll be fairly static, and you'll have what I would call a sort of random walk idea. So the random walk, that's a term I'm borrowing from mathematics, is just the idea that you have an equal probability that the line will go up or will go down at any given time. So within a certain range, a restricted range, maybe it's a major third, maybe it's an octave, whatever it might be, all of the chromatic semitones can be used, and there's no particular probability that's greater that it will be this note or that note. The fourth basic category of sound material in this composition is the attack resonance figure. So the attack resonance figure is basically a single sound that has a sharp, strong attack, and it might die away very quickly, or you might have a lengthy and complex sort of resonance following this initial sound impulse. So what I'd like to do now is walk you through an analysis of the first few pages of the piece. This corresponds roughly to approximately the first half of the first big section of the piece, and it lays out all of the main materials that you see in this work in a very clear fashion. So I'll take you through this, and I've color-coded the score here just so that you can see at a glance what the different sound types are. And I think that this method of analysis might also be helpful in the sense that it clearly shows you the block-like character of the music, the way in which he'll take a static segment of material, present it for whatever, a couple of bars, a few seconds, cut it off, replace it with something else, mix them up, and sort of reorder them all the time. So remember, most of these are very, very short little blocks, a few seconds at the most. There's a couple of things I want to draw your attention to. So one of them is you start with a very simple sort of ceremonial drum roll type of gesture. This is just like a sort of starting this ceremony type of idea. And that is also emphasized, I would say, by the use of a very low timpani, which is then followed by this sort of four-note rapid figure. So this, for me, belongs to the category of the moving line. So it starts with a long held note and then is abruptly cut off by this rapid movement. And that also, incidentally, introduces one of the main ideas of this piece, the main way in which this piece functions, which is this dialectic, this sort of constant opposition between two extremes. On the one hand, total stasis, as a long held note, and on the other, sudden rapid movement. And this is really a key component of how this piece functions. So we start off with that very simple gesture, and I've marked that in green. So all the green passages refer to a moving line sort of gesture. In the upper part of the score, you have this massive groaning sort of terrifying brass cluster. And I've provided a reduction of that just so that you can see at a glance what the actual pitches are. The black lines to the left of the note head simply indicate that these are clusters. So in other words, every chromatic pitch is present between the extreme notes indicated in my reduction. So we have a kind of quasi-fundamental tone played by the tuba, a low B flat, and then we have different areas of clusters from E natural to G natural in the upper part of the bass staff, from D flat to G flat in the treble clef, and then in the trumpets from C to E flat. So it's not a completely continuous cluster, but you have these sort of frequency bands that are more or less wide and that are distributed amongst the different brass instruments. Okay, so on the next page, you can see that this brass cluster is continuing. And one of the things about this brass cluster that I think is worth pointing out is that it's not a completely static cluster. It has a certain degree of dynamism in the sense that each individual instrument is playing these crescendos to a sforzando attack and then immediately going back to a pianissimo dynamic. So you have these sort of sudden crescendos that animate the cluster from within. In the strings, we have a very compelling sound object. This is something that you also see in earlier scores, like the Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima, which was completed in 1961, one of Penderecki's most famous compositions. Here we have a massive cluster that covers almost 3 octaves in the strings. And it's not just a chromatic cluster, it's an infrachromatic cluster, which means that we have microtones between all of the different pitches. So this is really a gigantic sonority made up of each individual player in the entire string section playing a slightly different pitch from the high G all the way down to the low B flat in the double basses. And so what that really does is it actually overlaps with the range of what the brass are doing. It sort of fills out and thickens the texture at that moment without necessarily enlarging the frequency band beyond what is already there. So this sort of unpitched noise, which is basically what you hear from the string section, is reinforced by the use of a tam-tam playing a pianissimo roll, and that just sort of adds to the overall complexity of the sound spectrum at this moment in the piece. Another interesting feature here is that this huge string cluster, it just sort of has, it's like it has an on switch and an off switch. It's like it's either happening or it's not happening, and then it suddenly stops. And then it starts again a few seconds later, just as though a switch had been thrown, and then it's turned off again. So it's sort of like a tap, right? You turn it on, the sound comes out, you turn it off, the sound stops. And this happens a few times over the course of the piece with a lot of these sound materials. So the next event on page 2 is a rather complex one. So we have actually 2 components here. There's an attack resonance event, and that actually has a couple of functions. One of them is that it abruptly introduces the sort of higher register into the sound spectrum of the piece at this point. So up to now, we've really only had these very low sounds from the brass and the strings. We have this very complex attack resonance gesture, mainly in the percussion and the piano keyboard sort of section of the orchestra. And this is actually very skillfully orchestrated in an extremely compelling way. So let's just pull this apart here for a second. So we actually have 5 different instruments contributing to this very complex attack sound. We have a vibraphone playing a cluster in its top range from D to high F, so all of those semitones will be present, so that'll provide a very sharp attack in the upper range of the percussion. We also have a sort of semitone chord played in the tubular bells, G and A flat. There's a triangle. You have the bass guitar playing an arpeggiated chord on the very highest possible position of all 4 of its strings simultaneously. So Penderecki is very fond of this notation. So when he wants to have an extreme pitch, either very high or very low, without necessarily specifying it, so here on the bass guitar, he asks the player to just put your fingers as high as you can up the fingerboard and produce these 4 very high sounds. Next, you have a very rapid harp glissando. This is a very interesting notation, incidentally, because here he just has this black sort of square. He just wants all of the pitches in this huge 4-octave range to be struck very rapidly with one sort of sweeping gesture in the harp. And the other thing that this section does here is it inaugurates the woodwind that are playing a cluster also in a higher register, so from the F sharp at the top of the treble clef to the F natural A major 7th above it. So this object I've sort of classified under the sort of chattering repeated note sort of texture. So you could look at it 2 ways. On the one hand, it is a cluster because it contains every semitone between F sharp and F natural. But I think that in terms of the gesture, in terms of the figure, the way we actually perceive this this object here, I think that it's the sort of staccato, irregular, repeated notes that immediately grab our attention. So what Penderecki is doing so far is this is basically an introduction section. He's sort of revealing the different sections of the orchestra one by one. So you have the percussion, you have brass, you have the woodwind, you have the strings. They're being sort of presented in this panel-like or block-like fashion. Each of them fills out a different frequential role within the orchestra. And at this point, once we have this sort of high suspended chattering in the woodwind, the soloist finally enters. So I've colored the entry of the soloist in green here just so that you can see that this is another one of the moving line types of ideas. So the gesture here in the solo violin part couldn't be simpler. It's a sudden, rapid, rocket-like ascension in the range of the instrument from a low G up to a high A. And in many respects, if you look at this within the sort of context of the history of the concerto, this could not be a more classical gesture. There are so many classical and romantic concertos that will start with a sudden ascending flourish, either arpeggios or a rapid scale of some kind. And there are just many, many examples of this. So if you take, for example, Mozart's Oboe Concerto, that's what it starts with. It's this sort of sudden leap up to the high C of the instrument's range. And it's like a sudden introduction to the instrument and to its range and to its sort of dynamic and articulational possibilities. And that's exactly what you have here. However, this is kind of a grotesque parody of that sort of gesture for a couple of reasons. One of them is that it's exaggeratedly fast. You actually can't tell what the pitches are. It's just happening so fast. All you hear is a kind of a blur. And secondly, it's played in this sort of rapid, nervous sort of articulation where it just comes at you very quickly. You don't really have time to figure out what the gesture is. It just rapidly swoops up into the stratosphere of the instrument's range. And once you get to that high A, the violin switches gestures. It moves from this sort of moving line type of idea to this sort of staccato, chattering, irregular, repeated notes idea. But before we talk about that, there's just a couple of things I'd like to point out about this gesture. So let's just hear that once more. So the main thing here is the overall shape or envelope of this phrase, the way that it rises. So the actual movement of pitches within that is not terribly important. You could probably look at it and pull it apart and see that there are, maybe some patterns within there. And many analysts have pointed out that some of the pieces in this period of Penderecki's output do sort of use in a very loose way certain serial techniques, but he tends to do so in an extremely free way. And in any case, the point is, even if there is some kind of underlying serial structure to the way these pitches are organized, it's not particularly relevant to our perception, and I don't think it's necessarily something that you would want to spend a lot of time on as an analyst, except maybe as a side note to point out that when he does use pitch, he tends to use some kind of a structuring framework, I suppose just to sort of free himself up and not have to worry about how he's going to generate all of the notes at a given point in the composition. And what he does do actually in this little violin introduction is he uses basically every single chromatic semitone within the violin's range from the G to the A. He just doesn't present them in order, and he repeats some of the tones. So it's like this meandering sort of walk, stepwise, chromatically up to the high A of the violin's range. So if we look on the next page of the score here, you can see that this chattering woodwind idea continues while all of this is happening. It sort of recedes into the background while the audience necessarily is going to be focusing a lot more on the solo part. Once you do arrive on the high A in the violin part, you have another attack resonance gesture. And that does one thing, which is it inaugurates not the woodwind this time, but the strings, who are going to be doing something extremely similar to what's happening in the winds. It's the same type of articulation, same type of gesture. It's just sort of reinforcing what's already happening in the woodwind, and it's also reinforcing the arrival point of the soloist on this high note. So it's basically a way of accompanying and amplifying the soloist's gestures. Shortly shortly afterwards, we have another presentation of the cluster idea. So we've already seen the brass clusters with which the piece opens. Here we have a variation on that principle where we have a cluster played on the vibraphone, again in the highest range of the instrument, and also simultaneously in the top range of the harmonium. So that's a very ingenious little piece of orchestration. Those are not two instruments that you would necessarily spontaneously associate with each other. So the next page basically represents a continuation of what we have so far, and after the violin has sort of finished holding that high A with these staccato repeated notes, it falls backwards. So this is a very, very, very simple gestural shape. And what we have here is a sort of meandering line that gradually goes back down to the violin's low G. So it's a completely symmetrical gesture. We rise, we stay on a high note for a while, and then we fall back down again. So now that the violin has sort of shown off its entire range, it's leapt from the lowest note to the high note, it can start to circulate a bit. In other words, we no longer have to move in a straight line up or a straight line down. We can sort of have these wide skips and wide jumps in the solo part that basically bring all of the notes of the different ranges of the instrument in play simultaneously, and that's exactly what happens here. Finally, we have one more cluster that appears in the horn section here. The horns are playing stopped notes, which gives them a sort of a nasal and kind of a thin metallic sound. So I hope that gives you an idea of what the sort of basic archetypal patterns and shapes and gestures are in this music. Again, it's always very simple and cartoonish. It's like it's either rising or it's falling or it's static or it's expanding or it's contracting, these very, very simple elemental shapes. And in many respects, I think that Penderecki, if nothing else, he was a genius at sound design, at sort of creating these extremely striking sonic gestures and deploying them in an incredibly varied and sophisticated way over the course of the piece. So I want to talk about the central section of the piece. I mentioned earlier that we have these two Eder movements that are characterized by these block-like sections and the rapid alternation between different sound materials. And a central section, which in every respect practically is very, very different from the outer movements. So what we have here is a continuous sort of descent gesture. It's got a sort of lament quality to it. It's got something very plaintive and very haunting, almost sort of spooky about it. And what I love here is that it starts with this sort of high-held cluster in the strings and in the solo part, which just very imperceptibly starts to waver and then to fall. It's a very beautifully orchestrated little gesture. So after the strings have descended in this sort of irregular shape, you can see that he doesn't even specify the pitches. He just tells each different member of the string section to do this sort of shape, and he draws it graphically on the score. So what this means is that in the violin section, where you have maybe 24 violins playing, each of them is going to be attempting to reproduce the basic shape of this line simultaneously. Obviously, no two players are going to do it in exactly the same way. They're going to roughly end up in the same place, but they're all going to be taking a slightly different path to get there. So that actually creates an extremely complex sound object. And added to that is the fact that he asked the players simultaneously with the bowing to hum the pitches that they're playing while this descent is happening. So you have this really ethereal sound where the entire string section is humming, sort of trying to reproduce the pitch that they're playing on their instrument while simultaneously sort of producing this irregular microtonal glissando downward shape. I think it's a brilliant little piece of orchestration. Once this gesture finishes, you have a sort of similar echoing gesture in the winds where he asks a group of flutes playing a cluster and saxophones to produce this little subtle glissando downwards. All of this emphasizes the idea of a fall that is the essential gesture of this whole section, along with the idea of the glissando. So in this section of the piece, we come to one of my favorite little bits of orchestration in the entire work, which is his use of the musical saw. So we have the strings sort of playing these low pitches, the soloist is playing these wavery glissandi, and then suddenly out of nowhere a musical saw appears and starts doing this ascending glissando and then this little wavering sound in the top part of its range. It's a beautiful little effect. Wouldn't be out of place in something like Eraserhead. I mean, it's this haunting, very strange sound, and I think it's honestly one of the finest moments in early Penderecki. He allies this very ethereal sound with the percussion group that plays on various metallic resonant instruments, such as the famous sort of group of approximately 30 copper and possibly gold pipes, which sort of produce this clanging, untuned, unpitched sound, together with the tubular bells and vibraphone and other percussion instruments. So finally, once this sort of descending gesture has reached its nadir, so to speak, we have this very strange and very moving section in which the cello section plays a kind of quasi-fugato sort of texture in which you have a single cello, solo cello that starts playing this very slow line, completely unpulsed, right? Once again, the pitches are just placed approximately here or there within the bar, but not in relation to any particular pulse or meter. And then successively, the second cello enters, and then the third, the fourth, and etc., until the entire cello section is in play. Now, if you pull this section apart and do a little breakdown of what the pitches are, it's very interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the pitched material in this piece is in fact sort of quasi-serial in the way it works, and you can actually very easily find instances of material being recycled, flipped backwards, and then transposed or inverted throughout this entire section. So these are sort of quasi-canonic, sort of imitative textures in the string parts, but the overall effect is not of a sort of polyphonic chorus of cellos, but rather of an overall sort of cluster of cello sounds within a given range. And of course, the more cellos there are entering into the texture, the more complex it becomes and the more difficult it is to hear the individual lines. But at the beginning, you do have a rare moment of sort of textural clarity in this piece where you actually can hear the individual lines and you can hear them sort of melodically. The other interesting thing about this is there's a sort of quasi-motivic aspect to this cello part, and that's not really something you associate with early Penderecki. But once again, it's not all just sort of clusters and undifferentiated sound masses. He also sometimes has very sensitively constructed little pitch materials in this piece. And in this sort of lament in the cello section, you do have this prominent use of semitones combined with tritones to sort of leap up to another another register, either higher or lower. So at this point, we come to the third section of the piece. The third section contains a recapitulation of many of the materials that we heard at the beginning, but he does add some new things that sort of keep it fresh and sort of keep us hearing these materials in a new light. One of the most prominent new materials that you have in this end are these sort of weird allusions to jazz. So remember that there's a electric bass guitar that features prominently in the instrumentation of this piece. When it suddenly sort of leaps out into the overall texture of this piece, it's always very sort of surprising and jarring when that happens. And then he also occasionally has these little walking bass type gestures in the bass section of the orchestra. In addition to those sort of sudden appearances of the bass guitar, you have these strange sort of semi-improvisatory outbursts from this saxophone quartet, and that's something where when it occurs in the piece, you cannot help but think of jazz. It sort of adds another degree of incongruity and wildness to the overall score of this piece, which after all is meant to be a violin concerto, and it's like suddenly you have this sort of jazz band marching in and playing this completely chaotic music. Two other gestures that I just want to tell you about in this last section of the piece that I think really speak to the composer's sort of sense of humor. One of them is this tempo de valse gesture that happens a few times in the final section. And what this is like the brass section plays this ridiculous parody of a waltz, like in this low register, these very dissonant intervals. And it's just sort of presented as though, like, from out of nowhere, these instruments just walked onto the stage and started playing a waltz for absolutely no reason. It's very funny, and then it's followed by this sort of what some analysts have referred to as a Bronx cheer, this sort of flutter-tongue semitone between the low contrabassoon and the low contrabass clarinet that sort of round off the gesture and make it appear even more ridiculous. It's hard to see this as anything other than sort of subverting the nature of a violin concerto, which in the classical period at least tends to be reserved for a very exalted, very noble form of expression. And here you have this sort of vulgar, crass, cartoonish sort of sudden interruption into the discourse, which I think is actually quite funny. So one more sort of parodistic element comes at the very end, and it's the soloist who gets to have the last word in this sense. So in the very, very end of the piece, you have this strange gesture where out of nowhere the violin plays an A major arpeggiated quadruple stop and then plays these sort of bariolage figures sort of moving up and down across the strings in a sort of upward glissando. It's a very peculiar gesture to end a piece like this, which has absolutely no tonal center, no allusions to tonality, and then suddenly at the very, very end you have this A major chord. And that's how the piece ends, on a sort of strangely sardonic, witty, sort of high note. So this is a piece that, once again, I think is remarkable for many, many reasons. It's hard to know how to interpret the humor, if it's like very, very dark humor or if it's meant to be sort of light-hearted. I don't know, it's kind of both at the same time. There's just such a degree of sort of ingenuity in the overall deployment of the music material here that I think you have to say that this piece, even though it's very much a product of its time, you don't see a lot of composers working in this direction now, at least not explicitly. But at the same time, I think it transcends its particular historic moment in the same way that a lot of the Ligeti pieces do. In the same way that all of the Ligeti pieces do. I mean, they remain great pieces. They're not simply sort of relics of a past sort of avant-garde era that we've moved on from. And I think the reason for that, the reason that this piece works and still speaks to us today, or at least to me anyway, and you can see what you think, and I hope everyone will add their comments at the bottom of the video and let me know what you think, is that the way in which the composer organizes his musical discourse is incredibly satisfying. It works, and it draws you through the piece with interest and with a sense of engagement from beginning to end. And regardless of the style within which Penderecki was working, he always sort of knows how to engage the listener. When he's at his best, he's full of surprises, full of invention, and capable of producing very intense and striking, emotional, and sort of a very direct, expressive connection with the listener. If you like this channel, support it. Your help allows me to keep on making high-quality music education videos available to anyone around the world who wants to watch them at any time for free. Check out the rewards for varying levels of support at www.patreon.com/SamuelAndreyev. Thanks for watching.